Thanks for joining me today. I'm very excited to be here. I'm also terribly nervous.
Don't be nervous.
Thanks, so much better. I'm terribly nervous. Up until Tuesday, last week, I was not even expecting to be at this event. Twist of fate, or luck, or bad luck, I'm not really sure. My friend Bart here, who was telling me not to be nervous, gave me a call and he's like, during this Twitter space, you're going to ask questions about this event. And I said, oh, fantastic. So that the world could learn about it and I could learn about it as well. And lo and behold, at the end of that Twitter space, somebody said, we're inviting you to come give a talk. That was last Tuesday. Between all of the organizing of flights and everything else, here I am giving a very recently curated talk. So please bear with me as we discuss how open source tooling can help you enforce policies and guardrails to actually bridge the gap between your development, security, and operation teams for better, more secure deployments, specifically in Kubernetes. Before we get started, my name is Courtney Nickerson. I am a developer advocate for a company called KubeShop. KubeShop is an open source accelerator that hopes to help different Kubernetes users with all the challenges that exist as they adopt Kubernetes and start that journey into a cloud-native world. I was introduced to the power of open source, and this conference has been fantastic because I was actually introduced into the open source community just a few years ago. I began my journey in this space about 4 or 5 years ago, not that long. I discovered the power of this community as a non-techie. Actually, as soon as I jumped into the open source space, I suddenly became a wannabe techie. And have spent the last 4 years trying to become a bona fide techie through different self-learning and, frankly, a lot of patience from the developers that I work with who answer all of my questions and put up with me wanting to be as experienced as they are. So unlike other speakers on the security track, I am not a security expert. I was blown away getting ready for this talk going, oh my gosh, it's the person who actually invented the concept of SBOMs. Why am I here? So I am not that expert level. However, I do spend an insane amount of time working with DevOps teams, developers, and security people, and really being involved in the culture. As a non-techie, it's really easy to actually see where there are gaps in cultural differences between siloed teams because you're always asking questions, and sometimes you have to go from team to team to find out the answers. So that is the superpower that I have. Not expert in all the technical stuff, but pretty well versed in all the human aspects. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Other than my non-techie turned techie push, I also help organize CNCF Build Bow community. I'm a CEVO ambassador, and I'm the mother of a 19-year-old and a 5-year-old. So my world's a bit hectic, sticky, messy, and oftentimes full of crying from different emotions. Not usually mine, usually my children, but sometimes me late at night thinking, what have I done to myself? And somehow I still got this talk put together, so let's get started. Specifically, this talk is geared toward Kubernetes adoption. So Kubernetes adoption is soaring. Everybody seems to be doing this. I thought a couple of years ago Kubernetes was a buzzword, but this is what people are doing. Expansion of a cloud-native landscape has made the importance of being able to deploy to cloud, but also scale your DevOps processes and your security processes. Incredibly important, but it also makes it very difficult. If DevOps was difficult before, now scaling all of that is even more difficult, as is security. And we were just listening to the talk just before us talking about how you cannot push all of this on developers. I'm also going to talk a little bit about why those silos happen and that this security in general is something that everybody needs to be involved in. So the DevOps landscape, especially in this world, has kind of entered into an adolescence because people are already struggling with the DevOps culture before they actually scaled to cloud. Now those struggles have just scaled along with all of the rest of their processes. And we have to find different ways and tools in order to be able to help scale those down and make them something that people can actually handle. So we're seeing teams across diverse industries actively grappling with the demands of the new DevOps era. They're not really sure how to do things. We have new roles that are coming into existence. So a few years ago it was SRE, now we've got platform engineers. We also see platform as a service starting to play a very big role. However, this platform as a service and platform engineers are still very much struggling to figure out where security or a security first minded approach actually fits in and how they can make that happen. So taking an early approach as you're building your platform, or when you're looking at a platform as a service, is going to be something that needs to be at the top of your list of things to keep in mind. Traditionally, there's been a gap between development, security, and operations. It's always existed. Before Kubernetes existed, this is something that has existed. And a lot of times security gets pushed off just out of the nature of a software lifecycle. So it's, oh, it more or less works, just ship it and we'll fix it later. Right, and when we're talking about developer experience, especially looking at Kubernetes and how people are living this, if you're a developer and you say, okay, I need another day and a half to do a really good job, and somebody says, oh, it doesn't matter, just ship it. And you then ship that, and then it goes to an ops person or a security person who looks at it and they're like, this really isn't very good. And you're like, I know, because I'm the one who sent it to you knowing it wasn't good. I needed another day and a half, but here it is. And that's kind of the continuous integration delivery is what a lot of developers are actually living. Humans want to do a good job, and developers specifically like doing a good job. But if they're constantly being pushed to ship something, then security is what's slowing them down. A lot of times it's not actually security that's slowing them down. It's somebody telling them, you don't have time to do a better job of this. And so there are different things that we can do. We're going to look specifically at how configuration policies can kind of play in this to give developers some sort of guardrails and rules that they can apply as they're going and not have to think about it and develop it themselves. It's just there so that as they're working, they don't have the context switching, and it can kind of reduce the amount of time that they would actually need. So instead of another day and a half to do super quality work, maybe they can cut that down to half a day so that they don't feel so frustrated that they've shipped something that isn't their best work, while at the exact same time not then receiving back from a security team or a DevOps team saying, this isn't good work, do it again. So saving some of that external and internal feedback loop and making it a bit nicer, we can do through security policies. So today we're going to talk about the different gaps that we have, the challenges in scaling your DevOps. We're going to talk about the bridge and how to build a bridge between your teams to better that relationship that they have. We're going to look at how to plan that bridge using configuration policies specifically for Kubernetes, and then talk about the teamwork that actually needs to happen in order to make this conducive for everyone. So let's take a look at some of the challenges that pop up when we're trying to scale our DevOps culture. So since the beginning of DevOps, this has remained somewhat of a contentious, multifaceted idea. Is it a culture? Is it an engineer? What is DevOps? Nobody has really gotten to a point where they're at a point where they agree on this. Some people very much identify, I'm a DevOps engineer. Other people are like, this is a cultural issue. I think there are fantastic arguments for all of those things. That's a whole nother talk that we can have in a debate. But whatever the answer is, it's remarkable that this has continued to stay relevant. DevOps is not going anywhere. As much as people want to say that it's dead, it's not. It's just going through a continuous, it's really a CI/CD pipeline of how people work as technologies continue to scale. So when it comes to scaling DevOps, security practices in conjunction with the adoption of Kubernetes is a struggle. And security gets left to the end of the checklist of things that you have to be able to do in order to adopt Kubernetes. So there's loads of resources, there's a massive learning curve. Who's actually managing the YAML manifest? Is this an operations team? Is it the dev who has to learn a new YAML configuration? Who's doing this becomes a gray area. that's the first step to the adoption, and people start to forget about security. It's something that will come later. DevOps heavily relies on an array of different tools. It's always relied on different tools. Automation, continuous integration, deployment across teams are all very complex. That complexity then scales when you move into Kubernetes, and obviously standardizing those tools and the processes of using them becomes incredibly important. Failing to uphold some amount of consistency as you're doing that means that you're going to actually fail in your adoption attempts to get into Kubernetes or to do anything else quickly. So then when you add the issue of security, which people, most of the time, security, somebody says, oh, security and compliance, and faces just glaze over, right? It's like, this isn't exactly something that people are like, oh, that's a sexy topic, and I really want to be in on it. But the reality is if you just build it in, then faces don't have to glaze over because it's just something that's going on. So those are all different things that actually make adopting Kubernetes quite difficult, and then scaling your security into that adoption even more so. Scaling workflows and processes is difficult, but scaling the culture of people and the gaps that happen, if they're already siloed workflows, then those gaps just scale as well. So you're trying to scale your processes, but your silos stay in one place, and that gap just continues to get bigger and bigger. And that really is the biggest challenge that people have. The diverse industries, the resource constraints, the budget, the lack of skilled personnel, changing business objectives, the applications being built, all of those things become incredibly difficult to manage, and then the human team just adds to that complexity. So because of this, creating a security-first culture requires fostering communication, collaboration, and empathy as your projects grow, especially when you're scaling anything. So all of those human soft skills become so much more important if you truly want to build a security-first DevOps lifecycle and build it at scale. So what does that mean when we're trying to build a bridge? Well, it's where policies and guardrails come in, so we'll talk about those for a minute. Policies and guardrails, can they be the bridge between DevSec and Ops? I believe they can be. So all of the challenges we just described are something that everyone has in common. They're super complex because they require a lot of collaboration from people across teams. Introducing policies and guardrails into your pipeline fosters a huge amount of cultural collaboration because it becomes a common language. So not just your process and your culture becomes a common language, but security suddenly becomes a common language because there are now some rules and guardrails for people to know what they should or shouldn't be doing in a shorter period of time without having to ask permission, without having to guess about it, without having to truly understand every aspect of security. They just know, okay, this is how I should set this up because there's a rule set in place for me to follow that. And it makes that adoption a lot easier. When you leverage them with purpose, they help foster a lot more responsibility and shared objectives because now everyone, whether it's a dev, an operations person, a security person, your team lead who's actually setting those policies, it makes security everybody's responsibility because you're using it throughout the entire pipeline. So everyone has rules to follow, and everyone can take responsibility of ensuring that those rules are actually put into place. That security-first culture promotes reliability and trust across your teams. As reliability and trust grows, it becomes a lot easier for your developer experience to get better, and the overall experience of everyone becomes better, and suddenly people care about security and they have time to do it because they're not having to guess what would be secure. They're not having to figure out how to code securely. They just had rules set into place to tell them what to put there. So let's take a quick look at what policies and guardrails are in open source tooling, different tools that exist in this space to help you do this. So in Kubernetes, YAML serves as a framework for defining the desired state of your clusters, applications and networks, and your Kubernetes policies are very much guiding rules. This is not something that has to be completed, but you're giving people some amount of structure about what they're supposed to do to ensure that they create secure and compliant YAML configurations for their clusters. Policies are categorized into configuration policies, so those can focus on basic security, resource allocation, best practices, naming conventions, setting a CPU limit, which is something that people don't really consider, but devs oftentimes are just told to make it work, right? So they set a massive CPU limit. That goes into production because they know that it works. So let me set this because I know that it works. It goes into production, it definitely works. But until an SRE gets around to looking at that, you have now consumed a huge amount, and all of a sudden you've got a cloud bill that you're like, where did this come from? It's such a small thing that seems insignificant to the developer, but to your business, to your pipeline, to your budget, this is not insignificant. You can totally prevent that. Reduce your bill by just setting a configuration policy so that somebody knows what the limitations are, from the lowest CPU that will work to the highest they're allowed to use. Right, so those are different things that configuration policies can do apart from just security. So it's not all about security, obviously. There are other things that can help bridge the gap. Then there are obviously runtime policies. We hear about this a lot in the security space. I'm sure all of you are used to hearing about runtime things. So when something's in production, there again is that, we'll just ship it, we'll fix it later. So we've got the anomaly of a firewall, which 20 years in existence has really not evolved. It's like the one piece of dinosaur tech that just doesn't die. But does it really do much? Not really. It's just there. We have to use it for compliance. There's so many other ways to actually build in security that are much more useful and going to save you a lot of those issues. But there are runtime policies. We've seen a huge surge in eBPF. Networking policies are big. Admission controllers, which are often used for configuration policy, are also a thing. Those are all production-oriented. So you already have the problem. It's there, it's live, it exists, and you've done nothing beforehand to fix that. So there are ways to actually build security in earlier, using configuration policies. So how are configuration policies defined? Well, they can usually, they're YAML. We all love YAML. If you don't have experience with YAML because you're not Kubernetes yet, you are so lucky. But Kubernetes policies can be defined by using declarative and imperative approaches. For declarative policy management, there are loads of open source tools. The most well-known for the Kubernetes space are Kyvorno, OPA, and other admission controllers, and those are very much YAML-based rules to enforce policies as you go. They check that your policies are set once everything has been deployed. On the other hand, there are also imperative policy management tools and other types of structures that are built into Kubernetes, which is an open source technology, like validating admission policy that basically lets you set different types of configurations to being low level to severe so that people know what's going on before they actually deploy. And then there's pod security standards as well, which people are having a very difficult time adopting, despite the fact that it is built into Kubernetes. So it's built in, it's literally a plug-and-play solution, and yet people aren't actually using it oftentimes. But these are all ways that you can actually configure YAML resources before you actually ship anything to ensure that you have much better security at hand. Policies can be applied to your YAML configurations at various points. I personally think that the earlier you do it, the easier it is. And then once you have your YAML configured appropriately, it's not something that you have to reconfigure every day, right? So if you secure it earlier on, then as you make small adjustments, you know exactly what those adjustments were. It's much easier to then adjust your configuration policies as you go, which actually downscales the security efforts that you have to make. While most common use of policies is at deployment, There are tools, open source tools, specifically Monocle is an open source project that allows you to do pre-commit, pre-merge, and deployment, as well as post-deployment policy configuration. You can actually build this into your pull request so that the grumpy person who reviews your pull request can see, oh, we haven't actually abided by these policy rules that have been set, so I'm not going to accept this pull request. But what happens is that when you have it built into your PR, that grumpy person becomes less grumpy because now they can put the responsibility where it needs to be on the team member that already knew beforehand that they needed to configure something a specific way and they haven't done it. So it's a shared responsibility across teams. Then your grumpy PR person sees that policy is up to speed. They ship it. Your ops person is much happier. Your SRE can now dedicate their time to make your site reliable instead of trying to figure out security issues after the fact. So these are all different ways that you can actually use configuration policies, pre-commit, pre-merge, and then in deployment to actually ensure that you have higher quality deployments and better security. So we've already talked a little bit about when you should actually apply security policies, but there's loads of time that's actually saved in fixing your misconfigurations early on. Applying policies early on isn't always possible. There's some things that you're not going to be able to configure until your application actually goes live, which is why it's always important to use an entire life cycle security. So security first cuts down a lot of your usage, but using things like admission controllers are never actually fall short. You need to have them because there are some things that can't actually be configured. And the whole shift left, I really have a huge problem with this phrase. People use it all the time in this space, oh, we're gonna shift left. Developers don't need more things to do. They need some support and some shared responsibility. It is not only their job to take care of security issues earlier on, whether it's in their code. There's also a QA team. There's also a security team that shouldn't just be giving them a printout of things without any context around what to fix, as well as the operations team. But if your team lead or the person who's actually giving you different tools to use doesn't make sure that everyone has a shared responsibility, then the problem is that developers have yet another thing that they have to deal with, which makes an even worse developer experience yet again. So now they're shipping something that they already know isn't their best work because they were told just to ship it. They get it sent back to them telling them it's not good work, and on top of it, you're now responsible for shifting everything left on top of you. It's not a good experience for anyone. Nobody wants to do this. You really do need to have an entire team who is security minded. So that's my spiel on shift left. I hear this all the time. It really irks me. This is why I love configuration policy, because it actually shifts everything back to the right. So if you want it to run a specific way, you take responsibility to tell me how you want it configured to make sure that when it gets there, it's the way it's supposed to be. I think it's only fair at this point. But it's not just policies that we need, right? There are also guardrails. Teams can use a variety of approaches to ensure that they're deploying compliant things. So approaches include implementation of not just YAML policies, but you can also use tools like your Helm charts, your customized overlays to ensure that you're effectively managing your configurations. You can use abstraction layers in other open source tools like Crossplane, Acorn. There are many others. Streamline this process for you. Make managing and deploying applications much easier because it is a crucial role in what you're doing. Successful implementation of guardrails ensures a cohesive and collaborative approach to what you're building and makes everybody's life better. So how do we actually bridge this gap? Well, teamwork, like always, makes the dream work. Taking a proactive approach to bettering your DevSecOps culture is crucial. And I cannot stress this enough. People always leave security to the end, but if you're in a place that's starting to adopt Kubernetes and you're starting to build a platform, the earlier you put this into your life cycle of adopting that platform, the easier life is going to be for a very long time. Get people involved is step number one. Devs can't understand that their CPU limit is affecting the budget overall of what the company has to spend on this if nobody explains this to them, right? SREs can't understand that a developer is super frustrated that they're shipping something too quickly if there isn't any conversation going on between your development team and your SRE, let alone the fact that SREs have a plethora of knowledge about what should be configured and how it should be configured, that if they had conversations with your development team or your operations team, they'd be able to share that earlier on, and everybody will have a much more complete understanding of why you're putting in certain rules and guardrails that need to be followed and how not following those is going to affect your overall outcome. Again, don't wait to get started. The earlier you get started with this, better, but if you've already waited, that's okay, just get started. It doesn't matter if you're quite advanced in your journey here, it's just a matter of getting started with something small and taking small steps. You should aim as high as you can, but start small. You never want to set a goal of, oh, we're going to totally reconfigure all of our policies. That's crazy, it's not scalable, nobody can do that. Start with very small, manageable things that your team as a whole actually sees the success and can measure the impact of what's being done and how it affects them. Implement collaboratively across your teams. So again, everyone should be having conversations. You should actually designate a policy lead who talks to different departments. I know this is a scary thought for many people, or it's just a disgust that comes across their face and you say to Dev, you're gonna have to talk to the ops team. They're like, please no. Or you say to a QA person, you're going to have to talk to anybody who's not testing, and they're like, why? I've got nothing in common with them, right? But this is really the problem. It's what makes things difficult to scale. It's what makes it actually difficult for people to work together. And it is what platform engineering, for example, should be working at doing. Tools can automate a lot of things, but they cannot automate culture. So take a culture-first approach and a humanistic approach to ensuring that more than one person is involved in this process and that people are talking about the different things that affect them, because in doing so, you can actually create policies that are going to truly be security first, as well as making everybody a much happier team. That's it for today. It was quite quick. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please reach out. I'm happy to discuss wherever you are in your policy journey, and hope we can connect. Thanks.